Okay, good morning, freshmen. Today I'm just going to talk a little bit about tone. That's the last element of style that we are going to talk about this week, and the next week we are going to move on to a different aspect of poetry. We're going to talk about sound, which will do with rhythm and rhyme scheme and stuff like that. But for today, we're just going to focus on tone, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven, and just kind of the meaning behind it, what it's about, and then some of the elements of style that we can see through that poem. So tone, we have talked about before, but just a reminder, it's basically the speaker's attitude or the poet's attitude toward whatever the subject is in the poem. So it's usually meant to express emotion. Their tone expresses kind of their feelings, their emotion, their attitude, their perspective, all that kind of stuff. So think of texting. When you're trying to express that you're happy, maybe you use more like exclamation points. Maybe you use emojis. Maybe you use kind of happier words. Whereas when maybe you're angry or you're kind of frustrated, you'll use like a period, or you won't use any emotions. You won't use any emojis. You won't put in any punctuation, stuff like that. These are different ways right now that you guys reflect tone in writing. In poetry, we have the same kind of thing happening where authors reflect their tone through use of exclamation points, through use of their word choice, through their diction and their syntax, through imagery, through figurative language. We understand this whole thing paints a picture of their attitude toward the subject, whether they're happy, whether they're lonely, whether they're sad or angry, anything like that is depicted through all of these aspects of style, and that is their tone toward the overall thing. So think of the poem that we've been working through, Robert Frost's Snowy Woods. And he is very calm throughout the whole thing. He talks about snow falling gently, and he talks about the gentle harness of the horse, and he talks about the quietness of the woods and how he's on his way and he has miles to go. But it's very calm. It's a very steady poem. We understand that it's kind of nostalgic. He's reflective. He's calm. He's thinking back appreciatively on this thing. The tone is overall very calm. It's a serious but pleasant poem. It's very calm. He doesn't use a ton of exclamation. He doesn't use a lot of punctuation. The word choice is really long and kind of poetic and drawn out. So through his imagery, through his figurative language, through his syntax, and through his diction, he creates this overall tone where we as the reader can kind of empathize and feel that calmness and feel that steadiness that he's trying to reflect through that poem. So that's basically tone in a nutshell. It's just the author's attitude. And again, the best way to think about that is the way that you yourself express yourself when you are writing. So all of you are familiar with writing text messages. That's something you all do. And all of you use different things to express your emotions. You use maybe a heart emoji to express happiness. Maybe you use no emojis when you're angry, different stuff like that. That's your tone, your emotion, or your attitude that is reflected through your writing and the way you choose to write about it. So that's tone in a nutshell. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about The Raven. By now you should have all read the poem. You should all be familiar with it. I know it's a little bit confusing, so I'm just going to explain it kind of briefly. The speaker of this poem is alone in his chambers, and he is reading forgotten lore, which would just be some old, like an old text or an old novel that we don't need to, like the title of it isn't really relevant. That's what he's getting at by saying forgotten lore. It's just he's sitting and reading in his chamber. It's dark and dreary. He uses that imagery to kind of set the scene for us. It's dark, it's cold, it's probably raining outside. It's a really kind of dark scene that he's establishing here, and we know that he's alone. And he hears this rapping at his chamber door. He hears this rapping, this tapping. And he goes, and no one's there. And then he starts thinking about his love, Lenore, who we find out is gone. She's died. She's passed away, and he's missing her, and he's feeling lonely, and he's feeling awful. And this raven comes in and perches itself up upon this sculpture of Pallas, who is a Greek god of wisdom, up above the door to his chamber, and it's just sitting there and saying nevermore at him. And over the speaker talks about how the raven's going to leave like everyone else in his life has left, and then he starts talking about how he's kind of sinking into this madness. So as the poem progresses, we see more and more use of exclamation, we see shorter words, we see him become more crisp with his language, we see kind of his spiral into insanity. And the reason this speaker is kind of going insane is because he's lost everyone in his life who he loves. He's lost his wife, his beloved Lenore. He sees this raven, and he starts kind of spiraling in his mind about the sadness that he's felt, the kind of hopelessness that he feels, and he just starts kind of crumbling. And that's established, that mood is really established through Edgar Allan Poe's continuous use of quoth the raven nevermore. We see that line multiple times in the poem where the raven keeps telling him nevermore, never again. And we know from the beginning of the poem that kind of represents his thought process of Lenore and his absence, her absence in the poem, and how much he's missing her. So if you look at the beginning of the poem, in the second stanza, He says, "Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor." So there he has a very specific syntax, a very specific diction, where it flows, it rhymes, it kind of keeps an upbeat rhythm, but we start to see it kind of go into this darkness with the imagery that he's establishing. It's bleak, the embers are dying, there's becoming ghosts on the floor. So that kind of tone is already being established of kind of starts out okay, but it's becoming darker as we progress through it. And then he says right here, "From my books, surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore." So this is the first time we kind of hear the evermore, and we know that she's kind of established evermore in his memory. She is lost, he misses her, he's always thinking about her even when she's not there, and then from here on out, his sanity becomes nevermore. He's so lost in this memory of her forevermore that his presence on this earth becomes nevermore, and that's kind of what's established through the raven. And then it just kind of grows darker and more dreary as we progress through the poem. You all should have experienced that as you were reading it, as you see his tone kind of become darker, kind of more frantic. We definitely see him kind of spiraling out of control. So if we go down a little bit, down to some of the last stanzas of the poem, this is about the third stanza from the bottom. He is freaking out, he's yelling at the raven. In his mind, he's going through all these things. He's really scared of this raven, of what it represents. He misses his Lenore. He's kind of drifting off into insanity, where he was freaking out that this raven is in his room. He wants to get it out, but we know, as with anything like this, that it's not about the raven. It's more about this kind of fear and this anxiety that the speaker is experiencing, that Poe is representing through his language and through his insanity as he starts having a conversation with this raven and longing for his love, and kind of just spiraling out of control. So, "Prophet," said I, "thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden if within the distant Aidenn it shall clasp a sainted maiden who the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore." So he's begging, he's asking, is it possible at all for me to ever see my love again? Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." And so he's just begging and pleading to try to figure out a way to deal with his grief. And the raven kind of represents the insanity that he's experiencing. Nevermore. You're never going to be okay again. You're never going to recover from this. You're just going to continuously kind of spiral. And so we see him get more and more frantic with his language. That's represented with the exclamation points, with all the em dashes, which are the long lines between some of his expressions. We see that with how frantic he starts becoming and the way he's talking to the raven. It starts off by describing the scene, kind of establishing the setting. He's kind of slow moving. He's just missing his Lenore. And then as the poem progresses, through the changing of the imagery, through the use of diction and syntax, suddenly he becomes more and more frantic. And we're able to grasp that just by reading it, by the way that Edgar Allan Poe switches up his language as the poem progresses and it becomes darker and more intense. And so then at the end, the very last stanza, we see this finally represented, where he's finally just kind of become mad. "And the raven never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door." So we see the tone is starting to pick up a little bit, like tone in this sense, I mean like the rhythm of the poem. It's starting to pick up quite a bit. It's becoming more faster paced, and through that we are able to sense the tone of franticness, of kind of anxiety, of that dread that he's feeling. "And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore." So he is essentially, there's lots of different ways you can interpret this. Some interpretations are that he's dead, that he kind of went into madness and is now dead, and his soul shall not be lifted, which we can interpret as meaning it's instead going to go down to hell. So he's kind of trapped in that eternal madness. Or there's a way of just saying, like, he's alive, but he's kind of detached now from reality. He's gone into complete madness. He's completely overwrought over the loss of Lenore. He's completely gone insane over the loneliness and the desperation that he feels. And so the return to reality will be nevermore. So there's lots of different ways to interpret this poem. There's lots going on with it. But I really wanted to point out to you guys the different use of diction and syntax, the way that the word choice and the rhythm changes as Poe moves throughout the poem to kind of get that more frantic feeling, to start talking more fast-paced, to create some of those darker images through the use of figurative language and through imagery, so that we, with the speaker, can kind of experience that downfall, that chaotic and frantic kind of whirlwind that he goes through as he kind of loses touch with reality and kind of descends into madness. And so we're able to experience that through this poem, through Poe's writing. So what starts out as a very calm poem, very reflective, still sad, but not necessarily crazed. His tone completely shifts as the poem progresses, as he starts kind of losing his touch with reality. And so we go from a sad, calm, lonely poem to a poem that the tone reflects kind of madness. And that's really evident. And he creates that through his style choices, through the use of his diction and syntax and how they change as the poem progresses, how it becomes faster paced and the rhyme is more and more, it's quicker and it's more abrupt. It's not flowing as smoothly as it does at the beginning of the poem. The language he uses starts becoming darker. The images start becoming more frantic. He starts talking about demons and about hell and about spiritual things and kind of creating that fear. He starts talking about like just the use of exclamation points, the use of the dashes, and kind of cutting things off short and being so abrupt. We just can feel that tone shifting as he shifts into madness, and that's where style is really important, is it helps convey Poe's point in this poem and just talking about the way that loneliness affects us and kind of spreads us into this madness when we don't have people in our life to love on us. And so that's kind of what Poe's getting out of this poem. It's one of his most well-known poems. It's meant to really depict kind of the madness and the insanity that people can feel through loneliness and how that kind of spirals and leads us spiraling out of control if we don't have like that community and that, you know, interaction that we crave and that we need. And I thought that was very timely given sort of the madness that some of us are feeling through quarantine. So yes, read through the rest of The Raven. I know I didn't cover all of the poem. It is a longer poem, but it shouldn't take you longer than 10 minutes to read. Read through the poem, answer the questions that are in classwork if you haven't already. Make sure you get that as well as your note sheet submitted by Monday. And then on Monday, we will start talking about rhythm and sound and rhyme scheme and all that different stuff and how that influences poetry. But that's basically it for style. If you have any questions, as always, shoot me an email or comment on anything in classwork and we can talk about it. But you guys have done a great job staying up to date with your work, getting stuff turned in, and I'm really proud of you guys. I'm impressed. I miss you, and hopefully I can see you again soon. Otherwise, I hope you have a great Friday. Have a happy weekend. Yeah, that is it. Bye.